Okay, so we're back to Cracks in Postmodernity with Sam Rocha. I said it right, I hope.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about politics, specifically socialism. But before we do that, Sam, just tell us a little bit about your background and the stuff that you're interested in, stuff you specialize in, and all that.
Sure. I'll kind of go a bit, more biography than interest first. I was born in Texas, in Brownsville, Texas, and grew up moving around in a lay Catholic missionary family. So I kind of I'm not just a cradle Catholic in the sort of generic sense, but kind of I grew up in church halls and rectories and all that stuff. And my family was affiliated with both the charismatic renewal movement in
Mhm.
the United States and also the Renovación Cristiana in Mexico and Latin America. So I kind of grew up in a bicultural, binational, Catholic, but Catholic on both sides environment. Um, if you know anything about the renewal movement in those at those times, then it's no surprise that I went to Franciscan University for undergrad and met my wife there. We got married right after, like good Franciscan students. And I went on to I studied philosophy in undergrad, and then I went on decided not to study philosophy, or so I thought, and I became a teacher, and I enrolled in a master's program at University of St. Thomas in education, and kind of found philosophy again there. But was fairly dissatisfied, and that dissatisfaction eventually catapulted me into getting my PhD in philosophy of education at Ohio State. Um, and Yeah, after that, I did a stint at Wabash College as a visiting assistant professor in Indiana, and primarily teaching American philosophy and philosophy of education, and then moving up to my first tenure track position in the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, and what we call educational foundations, which is just like philosophy, history, sociology of education.
Yeah.
And then 2014, moved out here to Canada in Vancouver, where I am presently, where I'm speaking from, and I've been here almost 8 years. Um, and I work in a interdisciplinary educational studies department, so where everyone studies ostensibly education, but from the perspective of different disciplines. And my discipline is a subfield philosophy of education. So we have a Noah's Ark rule. So there's two of everyone. So we have two historians, two philosophers, two sociologists, and somehow we have a lot more cultural studies people. I don't know how they figured that one out, but anyway. So yeah, that's a lot of my work. That's kind of my journey through the academy. Being raised Catholic and being raised in a particular kind of Catholic culture, I've pretty much been a very online Catholic since just the moment when Facebook stopped being just for university students in like 2004 and 5, all the way into the Catholic blogospheres of the mid to late 2000s, the Pathos blog stuff,
Yep.
writing some one-off stuff for First Things and Ethica Politica and any number of places, and now Twitter is kind of the place where one finds at least a lot of that discourse, and I'm also writing a bit for a few spots like America and Commonweal and a few other places, but yeah, and so I'm pretty, I think people listening to your podcast, right, fairly outspoken on any number of things. One of them within the last few years has been the question of socialism, and I'm expecting that's why you're interested in talking about that.
Yes. So let's get into it.
Yeah.
So I've had people on talk about different perspectives about our current political situation in the U.S., but I haven't had anyone speaking from, in defense of socialism. So I want to hear, especially coming from, from the Catholic faith, coming from that kind of worldview, how do you begin to make sense of socialism and also come to the conclusion that it's something of value in our circumstances today in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. That's a great way, I think, to frame the question of socialism, or the question why socialism, right? And I have maybe what may be a slightly uninspiring answer, but it's just very kind of basic, which is my orientation to socialism is principally a matter of kind of historical record. So
Mhm.
I came to my intellectual formation was heavily impacted by the school of thought, the Catholic school of thought called personalism,
Mhm.
in particular the French magazine Esprit and the founding editor of that magazine, Emmanuel Mounier. I consider myself in many ways a personalist first, and as a consequence of that personalism, a socialist. But to be honest, the commitment to socialism that emerges from personalism is in many ways for me just the historical artifact of any number of debates, including the debates between Mounier and Maritain, for instance, um, but also the movements, the very concrete movements. Some of, obviously, in his time, the anti-Nazi movements, the anti-Vichy movements, the movements that spread into Eastern Europe and Central Europe, in particular in Poland. But then today, it's really the the movements one finds on the left between kind of the fringe orientation of the DSA in the United States. So the DSA, this is something they're always critiqued by the real communists. The PSL always critiques the DSA for kind of being an outpost for the Democratic Party, at least since Sanders and AOC came in. And that's very much where I am in the DSA. I'm very happy to work in that very moderate, pragmatic place in American politics and Canadian society. That would be within the NDP, the National Democratic Party, and and it's very awkward place between the Greens and the Liberals. And if I was in Scotland, I would be probably a member of the Socialist Party there, which is actually, I believe the head is still a traditionalist Catholic of that party. If I was in Brazil, I'd probably be fighting for Lula and against Bolsonaro right now, part of the Workers' Party, which has socialist foundations. If I was a Tanzanian, I would probably be deeply impacted by the socialist vision of Julius Nyerere. My point here, I'm making it kind of through iteration, is that there's just a lot of Catholic socialism on the record and alive and working both within and working within the world, right? So like anti-Vichy, anti-Nazi, NDP, DSA, these are not fringe religious outlets. These are places that Catholics who, in my opinion, and here's my argument, really want to do real politics, which means do it in the world, ad secularum. That's where politics, I think, is done in the public square. And there's just a lot of work for Catholics to do, and that Catholics have done. One of the, along with Mounier, Charles Taylor has this very short essay called "The Agony of Economic Man," and I think it's from 1973, and it's from a collection of NDP commemorative essays called Essays of the Left. And I remember reading that very early age, very formative age. It formed basically a concept of what I would later come to learn. We have a word for it called neoliberalism, or the homo economicus, economic man. But Taylor expressed that for me then. And at the time, I didn't know Taylor, the famous Charles Taylor, Sources of the Self, Secular Age. But I was introduced to him as really an intellectual on the Canadian left, who's also Catholic, also working within the NDP. So the why socialism question for me has a lot to do with personalism, has a lot to do with my intellectual formation, but it actually has a lot to do with who I want to caucus with, who I want to associate with, and what historical movements globally within politics I see myself working within. And I will say that one thing that distinguishes the democratic socialist from the communist and from certainly the Maoists and the Leninists and all the others is that we're kind of like not liberal. We're pretty liberal friendly. And I think this also distinguishes the Catholic socialist from, for instance, an integralist who might have otherwise leftist opinions, but has a really hard stance against, modernism or liberalism. Frankly, I think liberalism is a much more difficult thing to understand, and it is the only game in town within liberal democracies, and that's probably a good thing, all things considered. And so even when it comes to political economy, for instance, this isn't abolish capitalism, abolish wage labor socialism. This is really democratic socialism that sees a place for shared markets, for private markets, for cooperatives, for a lot of stuff like that. So mine, I think, is a very pragmatic, but very historical and very concrete. Like if you want to ask me the details of like, how does one live in Canada and vote in the United States and be an active member in the NDP and the DSA Democratic adjacent, like, we can get into my writing here closely. We can get into my work within Texas, which is the state I vote in. That's how I like to talk about politics, frankly, is politically, issues, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So you're saying that you wouldn't consider this to be like a liberal position, but it's liberal friendly, you're saying?
Yeah, what I mean by that is that like a lot of the left, and in particular, I think what a lot of communists or what a lot of socialists who are probably trending harder to the left, so like the PSL, for instance, the People's Liberation Solidarity Party, for instance, the Gloria La Riva folks, they see an incompatibility thesis between mainstream liberalism, the Democratic Party, and their politics. The DSA, I think, has distinguished itself, especially recently, of not being unable to work within and with both grassroots organizers, anarchists, PSL if the issue comes up, especially when it comes to labor and unions and stuff, but also see a place for themselves within kind of the mainstream Democratic Party in terms of carving out a left wing to what has been a mostly right wing Democratic Party, historically, well, just in general. So that's what I mean by liberal friendly, is that for me, liberalism, both philosophically, but also in terms of real politics, isn't sort of a it's not an incommensurability thesis against the idea of socialism. I take it into view.
Okay, so then what do you make of the so-called post-liberal position that I see more and more Catholics taking, whether integralists or Democrat, what's it called, American Solidarity Party brand kind of post-liberalism?
I mean, I'd like to know more about what they mean when they say that. So that term has been used, especially within Protestant theology, for decades. Bill Plaker, a theologian working out of Protestant theology, popularized that term in the 90s. And what it meant, as far as I could tell from that dialogue, was a sort of a lot of what now post-secularism now means for a lot of Protestant discourse. And Catholics have taken up the expression post-liberal. I think its first Catholic iteration may have been by Bishop Barron when he was still, before he was a bishop, in his like 2006 or 2007 book, The Priority of Christ, I think. That, to my recollection, at least, is the first time I can map out the term. This is me to try and show good faith, right? Like, I don't want to just bash. I've tried to do my homework and I've tried very hard to understand what this means. Frankly, though, outside of those little sketchings and tracings, I don't think the post-liberal movement has done a particularly effective job of communicating what it is that post-liberalism means, and moreover, and probably more importantly, what it actually looks like. It reminds me a lot of the problems with distributism, which, look, I was like everybody else, everyone at 18 should be a distributist, right? Because Belloc is for teenagers, and that's exactly right. But you should grow up, and one of the reasons you grow up is you ask questions like, the classic question, how does one build an airplane as a distributist, or other questions like, how do we deal with the society that we have now with attention to the common good? And I think that, post-liberalism is, in my mind, probably something of a word seeking a definition. It's more of a feeling. It's more of an expression of disdain for any number of things, whether it's, a kind of a Catholic owned the libs brand or something.
It's an aesthetic, I think.
Yeah, it could be. Maybe it's an aesthetic, which is very fascist friendly. Attractive, of course, because that's the whole point of an aesthetic, hopefully. But nonetheless, like, I'm not particularly, I'm almost 40 years old, so it's like I'm not 18 anymore. So I want to caucus with people. I want to go to meetings. I want to talk about issues, whether they be infrastructure, water, housing, material, nutritional poverty. So to me, that's where my politics really are now. So I have very little patience. And the politics, by the way, of socialists like Mounier and others, the opposition to the Vichy French, or the opposition to Nazism, was not an aesthetic. It was survival. It was existential in the most basic lowercase e sense. So that's my reading of the post-liberal stuff, is that, like, the burden is really on them to if they want to bring a new political term into market, then the burden is on them to communicate what it means by that, and also point to some organizational and institutional places where we can go to these meetings, where we could learn more about it, where we can do the work of post-liberalism. Catholic worker, for instance, as a lifestyle is definitely an ethic and a lifestyle, and they have their saints, and literally they may have a saint pretty soon. I pray and hope, servant of God Dorothy Day, pray for us. The thing I love about the Catholic workers, and they do frustrate me, my younger brother's a Catholic worker, and it can be maddening, I'll admit, for all the reasons I've stated here. You can see I'm a very kind of just normie, boring, boomerish, guy, professor, whatever, just all the worst things you can imagine wrapped up into one. But one thing that I really admire about Catholic worker is they can take you by the hand and walk over to the day home where they're feeding people. They can show you the concrete work they're doing. You can enter into solidarity with them on issues that you care about in really concrete and manifest ways. I haven't seen yet where that exists for post-liberals.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm caught in this position, even though I'm much older than 18 at this point. I'm attracted to this whole post-liberal idea because, I don't know, and part of it's aesthetic, part of it I just think it's cool and countercultural, which is, kind of dumb and self-indulgent. But also, like, I feel the need to have integrity of thought. Like, distributism is a much better idea than all the liberal options that are out there. Post-liberalism it just makes more sense. It's more human, but it's not a real livable option unless you're a Catholic worker, and not everyone's going to drop everything and go to a Catholic worker farm.
Sure.
But it's like, what do I do with the fact that I have this attachment to the integrity of ideals, but also realize, like, this is being idealistic? And I remember I asked you for a quote when I was doing an article for NCR on, like, third parties, and you were saying something about, like, at the end of the day, we have to be realists. Like, we have to look at, like, what are the real options. I have a very hard time doing that, maybe because I am an idealistic millennial, but, like, I don't know, what do you say to someone who is very attached to having the right ideas, even though they're not livable? Like, I don't want to make that sacrifice of entering into reality because I know I have to compromise the integrity of thought.
Yeah, I think that's just a really generous proposition in relation to the admittedly very provocative answer I gave to your first question of the why socialism, and then what about post-secularism follow up. I mean, look, I'm an old millennial. I'm an 82, so I'm like on that doorstep. I just kind of behave and have in some sense recently adopted the posture of a less interesting boomer, and maybe that's because complacence that I got tenure in 2019, or maybe there's some psychoanalytic reasons or whatever. I don't know. But the question is a serious one, and I have to say, and you already know this because of that quote you got. Like, this has not always been my position. I took in fact, I only voted third party. My very first vote was cast for Alan Keyes. And my voting record is all over the map in terms of left, right, and center, third party, abstentions, the McIntyre
Mhm.
option. It's only been somewhat recently, in fact, that I've taken this very realist position. In fact, social realism, was one of the planks of my two-tier argument for voting for Joe Biden, right? So I say that just to show sympathy, right? So it took a lot, you know, I was a lot older than 18, if I'm being honest,
Mhm.
along the way. Nonetheless, having said all those things and having granted all that ground of hopefully understanding and mutualism, I do have to say that there are two problems, I think, with the assumption that one can't keep one's ideals, or that the ideals of this aesthetical view are more attractive. So it's one thing for some ideas to be more attractive than others. I can't dispute that. What makes ideas attractive? I mean, that's so difficult, right? But I can say that liberalism is not a monolithic tradition whatsoever. Um, and whether we're talking going back into classical liberalism or into Locke, or if we want to go back to the very foundations of political philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, and Aquinas has this really cool idea, the dominus sui, the
Mhm.
sense of it's almost like the seed of the idea that would become autonomy and liberalism. Like, in other words, ideas, if we're serious about them, ideas, and I think we have to abandon some of the aesthetical affectations of attraction. But if we're serious about the ideas and we get down into them, just like, let's go over to a place and feed some people, let's grab some books, break them open, find a page, get a good translation, at that level of ideas. And this is my biggest problem: a lot of idealists aren't idealists because they're not doing that kind of work with the ideas they claim to be serious about. And if you're not doing that kind of work, then I don't think anyone is allowed to call themselves an idealist. They're a pseudo-idealist.
Mhm.
They're entertaining themselves with a kind of intellectual affectation, but they're not doing the work. But if you do the work, what you find, I think, is liberalism is not a self-contained tradition. It has antecedents that take us well into the ancients, and are anticipated, if not built upon, um, the Catholic intellectual tradition, which of course is built upon Hellenism, which is of course built upon other things whatsoever. But on the other hand, that liberalism evolves and changes and enters into very different kinds of dialogues and internal disputes. So like, here's a very simple, two liberalisms that I would encourage those who find liberalism unattractive to check out. Late Millian liberalism, like, you could just read On Liberty if you want to, but
Mhm.
even beyond that, like, I just think late Millian liberalism is actually very different from Lockeanism. It's very aware of the challenges to political economy made by Marx and others in the 19th century. It sits really nicely beside people like Belloc and Chesterton. For one, they're all Brits, more or less around the same time. And then Rawls, I mean, I find that a lot of people who are bashing liberalism couldn't take you through the veil of ignorance argument in Rawls step by step. Well,
Mhm.
come on. I mean, or justice is fairness argument, some of those things. Now, in terms of the real politic and not the political philosophy, yeah, there is something kind of uninspiring about the status quo. No one wants to be status quo because it's not cool. But again, like, are we in high school or are we actually being serious? I think one of the reasons why liberalism is status quo is precisely because of the flexibility of its ideas and the capacity for some of its ideas to even diverge in radically different positions. For me, the tradition of personalism, and in particular Catholic socialism, but also just democratic socialism in general, is this real evolution, especially after the failure of Stalinist, Leninist, Maoist communism, to say, no, liberal democracy is not it's not something we can just throw away. Totalitarianism is not going to be the answer here. Yet, nonetheless, there are collectivist aspects that are going to be critical of some of the articles of faith of the liberal Democrats, who we see as having an important way of life to offer. And now we need to enter into that messy dispute. And to me, that's where the rubber really hits the road. And to me, that's what realism means. Not only at the level of let's feed some people or what have you, but also at the level of, like, let's get serious with the books. Like, if we want to be idealists, then let's grab some book spines and let's sit down and break bread and really hash this out. That's the work I don't see post liberals as doing at all, frankly.
Mhm. Yeah, and I feel like that position I can get with, because again, at a certain point, like, you do have to grow up, you have to mature and sacrifice like your aesthetic affectation, which I know I have to do at some point. But I do still feel like, even if we're going to be realists and deal with like the actual circumstances we're in, I would never want to sacrifice like the prospect of like critiquing the ideas of the status quo, like to critique, like, I would never want to go wholeheartedly along with it, as much as it may be more pragmatic to do so, because I don't know, like, I just think about Dorothy Day and like the whole idea of the clarification of thought, because like, to me, that's so crucial to have a clear understanding of what's at stake and what are the problems with it, so like, I would hope that at a certain point I can come to the place where I can embrace the tension between like, okay, I'm living in this culture, I'm living in this society which requires certain things of me, and yet I'm detached from it. Like, I understand what the flaws are, and I'm able to talk about that freely. I'm able to acknowledge, like, yeah, like, this is problematic. I
Yeah,
just
for
feel like when
sure.
we wholeheartedly go along with the program, knowing that there's just so much cognitive dissonance
I
there.
think so. I also think sometimes the program just gets a really bad rap, right? So, like, for
Yeah.
instance, one of the ongoing accusations almost about liberalism, especially in the academy and in universities, which is kind of where I live, literally. I live South Campus, UBC. Um, is, you know, that like all professors think identical and stuff like that. And like I can see the truthiness of that claim. It's been made for a long time. I think
Mm.
William F. Buckley made the claim in like 52 and God and Man at Yale. And basically that book gets rewritten every decade, you know, and people think it's this radical. Here's the thing, counterculture is actually very status quo. Like people coming out and saying the libs need to be owned because they're boring and they don't do the right things. Actually, that's just as repetitive and status quo to me as improving housing conditions for the poor, you know, which has also been an ongoing project by, you know, liberals in general, at least in the United States and other places. So like to me, it's like I'm not so convinced that counterculture is nearly as radical as people think, because again, I teach Plato uh, every term, and Socrates is countercultural, and these stories we're reading are 2,400 years old. For me, what really matters is less about kind of using status quo as a put down and trying to get countercultural, but it's really about, again, not only the realism of external conditions and concrete situations, but also the realism of ideas. Like there are actually, I think, some radical ideas that we could treat with maybe more respect, and find our ways with. And one of the things I pointed out in my case whenever I debated Trent that I kind of really regret got ignored by everyone was I showed how like both Benedict XVI and John Paul II had a very deep and very concrete, they could name the exact concepts, appreciation for the thought of Marx. And not only for the thought in general, but for specific concepts. So for John Paul II, he's like, yeah, I don't know about his anthropology, but the place of the idea, the concept of alienation in his thought is absolutely central,
Yeah.
right? Benedict XVI actually probably takes more from his political economy
Yeah.
than John Paul II does. And to me, those deep appreciations, Alistair McIntyre's, you know, Marxism and Christianity, Herbert McCabe, obviously, you know, a full-blown, you know, Dominican Marxist. What fascinates me here is not so much that they're going against the tide of most Catholics aren't supposed to like Marx or they're going with it or whatever. Well, what matters to me is that I actually just think the problem of alienation in Marx or out of Marx is just a really great way to talk about a central, haunting
Yeah.
problem for people today, and that people can feel in their stomachs, and that when we listen to the radio, when we listen to top 40 music, we're
Mhm.
hearing being spoken about and sung about, and we're suffering from. And in my mind, every light that can shed itself upon that problem and bring us into encounters and communities to talk about it is worthwhile, and ultimately from God. And so for me, that's really where the rubber hits the road. One of the problems I don't like is there's a lot of obstacles to getting to what I just said, because I have to explain to everyone, why in the world are you talking so much about Marx? Why in the world are you trying to focus on the little times that JP2 and Benedict 16 talk nicely about Marx? Are you a Marxist? Are you a socialist? Do you want to murder millions of people? You see, and
Yeah.
it's so ridiculous, you know. But I don't trust the counterculture though is countercultural. I think counterculture is more status quo many times than the status quo. I find more radical these days, at least for me in my
Mhm.
life. I'm finding a lot more radical things like, how do we solve a problem of like infrastructure? I find that radical now.
Yeah.
I also love my vacuum cleaner. So like maybe I'm just becoming a very boring, uninspiring person, right?
No, I mean, I definitely agree with the Marx thing, because when you actually read Marx and not just look at communism as like a social political
Mhm.
phenomenon, like the guy's a genius. Like he really had his finger on so many
At the
issues.
very least, he was well read. Like I just love reading Capital Volume One,
Yeah.
in part because of its. I often track all of its references to religion, whether it's
Mhm.
literary and in some cases direct. You can read it ethically or morally, and it's very moralistic. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't. He can't say half the stuff he says without a really basic concept of evil. He uses the language of sin.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, it's just fun. I mean, you know, it's fun for all the reasons. Some of my friends say that I never want to read Plato because they hear I'm so excited, and I'm like, I don't want you to be a Platonist. I just think that like
Yeah.
questions like, you know, how do you know, you know, the Minos paradox, you know, of like, you know, how can I know that I don't know something? How will I know what it is when I find it if I don't know what it is? You know, how
Mhm.
do I go hunting for an animal that I've never seen before? I won't know what to shoot at, you know.
Yeah.
That's a cool problem. It's, you know, and maybe this is just me saying I'm a philosopher and I like these problems. But I think any idealist should have not only an attraction to an aesthetic, but a real attraction to actual rational conceptual situations that are difficult and that are perplexing and that are, you know, these aporias of thought.
Yeah. So, and since you brought up the folks in socialism, I want to go back to Rerum Novarum and Pope Leo
Mm-hmm,
the 13th,
mm-hmm,
because that's where I get most of my hangups about the socialist position. Because first, like he explicitly, I mean, first of all, he's critical of communism, but he does talk about socialism, social welfare, and whatnot. Um, I think like my biggest concern is like when it comes to subsidiarity, this whole idea that we solve problems at the most basic level first. Primarily, I mean, for me, I think it's because that's where people's needs are best understood. Like there's more possibility of an encounter with the person. I mean, speaking of personalism, but
mm-hmm.
also the reality that like the further we removed we are from the individual, like the more possibility that original sin can go unreined and really do violence to the individual to create real destruction. Um, so I don't know, like, what do you say to that? Like, what do you say about the potential of I don't know. I guess this allowing the state to have that much power to make economic decisions for. I don't know. I'm probably not framing it well, but like
No, no, it's an absolutely real danger. And I think the main thing here is just to admit that look, every political orientation has its under and over determinations, right?
Mhm,
So socialism underdetermined, one finds a kind of communitarian anarchism. In my opinion, that's not the worst thing.
mhm,
Socialism overdetermined uh, basically accelerates into the excesses of, totalitarian communism, right?
mhm,
In some sense, I think socialism is an attempt to hold a place between a broadly statist concept of the good life
mhm.
and a stateless concept of the good life, between a kind of libertarian anarchistic position on the one hand, and between a sort of statist. Now, the communists listening, I don't know if you have communists listening, but the
Uh-huh.
communists listening are going to reach through the screen and grab me by the collar and say, the state is not eternal. The state is always temporary.
Mhm.
Okay, great. But socialists have seen enough totalitarian states to say that even the temporary ones kind of suck. So we don't want, we don't even want that temporary state. That's what the tankies, go into.
Yeah.
But to me, I guess that's the main point is just to say that, like, I think any thinking person should not be a partisan to their political ideas, but should be very sensitive to where their under and over determinations are. Having said that, for me, the principle of subsidiarity, and in particular the concerns, the legitimate concerns during the 1890s, by these, you have to remember that the internationalist conventions were happening during this period of time,
Mhm.
where the workers of the world unite kind of mantra was coming together, and the church was watching this in addition to a number of other global movements. um, After, with the French Revolution and the other revolutions, in the rearview mirror. And basically everything that looked like a large internationalist, collectivist, populist movement pretty much gave the church the willies because they tended to be anti-religious. They tended to be very aggressive, if not overtly hostile to the institutional church, all the way down to its people. Um, what I think is amazing is that nonetheless, having all those concerns, the church, much like the First Vatican Council, but in particular in Rerum Novarum, that the church said, no, we're going to enter into the fray. We're not going to stand outside anymore. And
Mhm.
that he actually took some very, very almost identical positions to the ones being debated on the floor of the internationalist conventions by Marxists and socialists and communists and people around the world,
Mhm.
and created things like Catholic Action
Yeah.
that became allies when they could work in solidarity with those movements as well. And but you're absolutely right. The question of the state is a very serious, I think, question, and I think that one of my problems with integralism and with a lot of the authoritarian impulses of certain post-liberal folks is their comfort with a concept of the state that is maximalist, or in some sense, in my sense, violates that principle of subsidiarity.
Mhm.
I can't be a socialist without being a personalist, and I can't be a personalist and a socialist without being a democratic socialist or a
Mhm.
social democrat. Demos kratos means people power. The demos there is the core.
Mhm.
And one of the beautiful things of the Catholic understanding of the person, we see this in some of the Communio early stuff that got sketched out by von Balthasar and by Ratzinger at the time. Uh, our concept of the person is this beautiful pluralistic concept.
Mhm.
We understand it in Trinitarian terms. And so the person themselves holds within themselves this kind of public. And so where we find a person, we find a kind of state. This is as classical as Plato, right? Where the soul was divided into classes and we saw this civic unity of the self, right? And really political philosophy is born from that Platonic sense of the civics of the soul, moving from the Republic into Augustine into Aquinas all the way through. So this is how I kind of sneakily account for my socialism, my demos kratos, within this principle of subsidiarity. If we
Mhm.
understand the principle of subsidiarity through a unit of one, which is a unit, which is a civic one, a plural one,
Mhm.
right? Then I think there's a place there for a creative tension, but nonetheless a constructive engagement with the notion of the state that is relegated by analogy into that. But again, this isn't like this is very kind of analogia, and this is analogical
Yeah.
Catholic metaphysics. There's nothing here that's particularly modern or newfangled. But I think that Catholic socialists, especially the personalists, have always had almost an advantage over their secular comrades, because I think we actually have a lot more conceptual firepower
Mhm.
whenever it comes to making this. Whereas in a secular socialist, they kind of do have to, frankly, um, admit to some positive notion of the state that is external and is not internal, and that
Mhm.
external state as opposed to the internal one that I just described analogically, I think it is a problem for Catholics, and I think that the popes from Rome Novarum all the way through history are right whenever they are concerned with that.
Mhm.
Pope Francis even does that in Laudato Si on a different issue, but with he notes the problem of both an anthropocentric and a biocentric approach to ecology. and he calls for a kind of lowercase I integral
Mhm.
approach, which what he means there is neither biocentric nor anthropocentric, both biocentric and anthropocentric, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that's what we can. I think that's when like solidarity and subsidiarity, when we have that beautiful marriage of the two concepts, then I think Catholic social teaching really begins to bloom. And there's no indication to me that socialism, and especially Catholic socialists, have had any problems in that garden, historically.
Mhm. So then the other question that kind of ties into this, so he's very critical of what he calls like the social welfare state, because
Hmm.
from what I understand, he's saying that it compromises the freedom of the individual, but also their sense of responsibility and participation in, the civic sphere. So what would you say to someone who's associates socialism with this social welfare state? And again, like this compromise of the person's freedom and their sense of responsibility.
I mean, the question of what to do about the dole is one of the oldest questions in liberal societies. And believe it or not, Marxist socialists, liberals, conservatives have not always held a kind of ideologically consistent position on the question of the dole or the question of social welfare.
Mhm.
In fact, you will find many forms of social conservatism, which on the basis of family emphasis and things like that, have much stronger social programs and welfare around dole type systems. The question of the dole is the question. That's the way Marx talks about it whenever he
Yeah.
talks about it. So I'm saying it that way. Antiquated. I mean, I would say two things. One is that the question of the dole in 1892, I promise you, is not the question of UBI today.
Okay.
And Pope
Gotcha.
Francis and Let Us Dream literally endorses the UBI, Universal Basic Income. Um, uh, I don't think he does that in ignorance of the concerns of the excesses of the dole and of forms of social welfare. But look, I mean, the Catholic Church has not only, I think, developed a robust understanding of the common good, but we have some of the strongest institutions that work with both national and international governments and states, providing social welfare for people using both tax monies, international efforts from states. So, like, Catholics are really in no position, I don't think, to make any robust efforts to talk about this until they investigate how Catholic charities, how any number of NGOs, how any number of religious orders work alongside and with states, taxation based revenues to literally provide not only healthcare, but many other kinds of things. And you know what? I'm proud as a Roman Catholic. I'm proud of this. I think we all should be proud of this. I think we should all pitch in as well. And you can't feel those emotions of religious pride and participate without, in some sense, endorsing, I think, the non-problematic elements of that teaching. And then you go to the Catholic social teaching, and then you go to 1892, and then you go to Rerum Novarum, and you sort it out from there. But I mean, this is my realism maybe kicking in here, right?
Mhm.
But the point of the fact is that social welfare is a wonderful thing right now in a lot of cases. Is it abused? It can it disincentivize any number of things. Yeah, there's one thing. Now the communist is kicking down the door saying, "Don't forget, Sam, talk about socialism for the rich."
Mhm.
And we have to remember that to the extent that we're talking about the problems of social welfare, we have to think about tax credits to corporations. We have to think about the abilities for the rich to not only forego paying taxes, but also to privatize public goods like water, any number of things like that. And so those questions, I think, are actually the thornier questions that a person using the aversion to social welfare and rerum novarum doesn't find a nice default situation to be sitting in afterwards.
Mhm. So then, fast forward to Pope Benedict. I've heard a lot of different takes. I think it was on Deus Caritas Est, because he
Mm.
does have a section where he talks about democratic socialism. And I
Yeah,
see
yeah,
some
yeah.
people say, look, it's proof that the Pope is endorsing it. And then I see other people saying, like, oh no, but he's actually saying Catholics can't be democratic socialists. So what's your take on that
Yeah,
part of the
I used the quote in my case. I don't actually I actually don't think it's in Deus Caritas Est. I think
Is
it's
it
in a it's in
Caritas?
a I think it's actually in a First Things like one-off thing he wrote.
Really? Was it that?
Yeah, I think it's like a so the context of the article has nothing to do with socialism. He's
Mhm.
talking about basically religion in the West.
Okay.
And the context for that is it happens right around the time he has this book-length dialogue with Jürgen Habermas
Oh,
called The
okay.
Dialectics of
Yeah.
Secularization, right? And so the question on his mind, this is where I think both of those sides are frankly trying to cherry pick that quote and raise it as some kind of a flag. And
Mhm.
we shouldn't do that. It's lazy, it's obnoxious. It's frankly it's stupid. What's on the Pope's mind during this time in both this article and as we see in his extended dialogue with the critical theorist, Marxist, atheist Jürgen Habermas
Mhm.
is what is secularization going to do to religion, both as a cultural form, all the way to its ecclesiastical effects on the church in Europe, right, in
Mhm.
Western Europe. Um, and it's within that context that he talks about the secular stuff that was able, that is despite itself able, seems to have certain impulses for the stuff that matters to Catholics, right? And
Mhm.
so within that context, he says, well, like he's not very positive. He doesn't have, see a bunch of people who are willing to work with Catholics. It's a fairly dim view
Mhm.
of the situation, and in that dim view, he names the social democracy, which is exactly what I talked about earlier. It
Yeah.
would be the Mounier anti-Nazism. It would be the Orange Revolutions of Central Europe. It would be Catholic Action. It would be, in Italy, it would be the anti-fascist, coalitions that were built around socialism. He's referring to all this historically within the history of Europe as the potential allies of Catholics.
Mhm.
And I just think he's historically right about that,
Yeah.
namely because there were a lot of Catholics in those groups. Now, there were also a lot of Catholics in the fascist groups, but notice he doesn't see them as allies, right?
Yeah.
There were lots of Catholics in the liberal groups. He doesn't name them as allies. He only names the ones by association in this. And the context of that can only be understood whenever we are willing to sort of really get into the weeds of basically that deep dive on European history, and that assessment of religion in Europe that he's doing. Everyone else trying to turn this into a banner or a flag to fly is really abusing the our Pope's generosity to make these kinds of remarks at all. I mean, it really, I think, is offensive. Now, fast forward to Francis's comments, I think in like 2016, where the quote that everybody wants, or wants to really hate, is Francis's quote, where he says that it's the communists who truly understood the gospel because they're always on the side of the poor.
Yeah.
Now even that remark, though, I think can only be understood from a Latin American, South American
Yeah.
perspective.
Exactly.
Whenever we understand, well, who are the communists that Francis is talking about? Is it Stalin? Is it Mao? No, it's not. He's talking about the rise of the Workers' Party in Brazil. He's talking about the coup in Argentina. He's talking about Latin American politics.
Yeah.
And so to me, this is kind of my very boring assessment of a lot of these sort of cherry picking quotes. Is that
Mhm.
we should show more respect to both ourselves intellectually, but also to our church and our tradition, than to try to fly a quick flag up of our mast of whatever it is, the moment we seem to find something within an entire essay, an entire period of time, an entire person's thought, that suddenly seems to endorse all of a sudden for no reason
Mhm.
what we think. I mean, come on, we should grow up.
Yeah. So the last thing I would want to ask, so I don't know, I hear a lot of people talk about a possible collaboration or an overlap between, I guess we could say, far left democratic socialists and, I guess, right wing populists, or people who are disillusioned with the
Sure,
state of things.
sure,
People who,
totally.
I think the overlap would be like an interest in the working class, the needs of the worker.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
What's your take on it? Do you think there is a
Mm,
possible collaboration? What would be the
yeah.
grounds of it? All that.
Gosh, this is a difficult question that I have. I'm right now a friend of mine. He's a local philosopher, anti-fascist, communist, who really only wants to talk to Catholics
Mm.
about politics, besides his own brand. And he has one of these lefty presses that he got me a copy of a working group in the Philippines, of kind of a radical revolutionary Filipino working group,
Mhm.
that read the compendium of Catholic social teaching and uh, wrote a commentary on the compendium of Catholic social teaching by a radical anti-fascist communist revolutionary group in the Philippines, writing under kind of like a pen name.
Mhm.
The reason I say this is, as I read this, your question really rings in my ears, because not only are they bringing to it, well, for one, there's the cultural comfort of a Filipino reading the church as a secular, but from a culturally Catholic
Yeah.
place, where like I'm kind of astounded that they seem to be better interpreters in some cases of
Mhm.
Catholic social teaching
Interesting.
than certain, Roman Catholics writing and talking. Even not just certain, I'm not talking about my enemies. I mean, better than me
Yeah.
in many cases. And so that's been kind of humbling, but also perplexing. I don't understand why. But your question about, the alliance of right-wing populist um, movements focused on the working poor, and then the radical left. This is I think the question that we're living in right now.
Mhm.
And on the one hand, I think that there needs to be a really dogmatic position taken by the left that says we can only enter into solidarity um, on like workers based, or the poor, or whatever, in good faith, right? It can't become a sort of class identity politics sort of a thing, right?
Mhm.
But on the other hand, it's undeniable to me that the success of right wing populism, right wing authoritarianism, with the poor, um, is a live example of that, lumpen proletariat problem that's existed in leftism since Marx, which is that, frankly, those who are classed as the oppressed are often not particularly interested in investing themselves in a project of social change. So to say that your work will be in the spirit of freedom and democracy and all these other kinds of things as someone who doesn't represent those classes is nothing but a sort of sophisticated form of elitism. And I think this is really dangerous territory conceptually. I think Catholics love, well, I think a lot of post-liberal Catholics love to take advantage of its weak spots because it reveals some of the ironies of liberalism, of democracy, of civic society. And you can take real joy in kind of throwing rocks through those windows and laughing at it. Ha ha ha, I just broke the stained glass window. Yeah. The issue there, though, is that those paradoxes are not unique to liberalism. And whenever we turn that gun around and we take it into like dogmatic propositions of the faith, teach church's authority on faith and morals and stuff, we quickly see that we belong to a tradition where we do not necessarily assume out of hand that coercion, the law, and those kind of things are antithetical to freedom insofar as they're directed towards the good, right? And I think that whenever we add the ironies of our faith to the ironies of secular public and popular life, I think there we see actually an interesting intersection. I'm speculating here, but it's something that as I read this book and as your question rings in my head, I think about a lot. A lot of poor, quote unquote, uneducated nations, people, whatever, are religious.
Yeah.
And they are clearly the beneficiaries of a kind of social program of the left, and they are famously, in many cases, opposed to those programs when they arrive, or very happy to take advantage and exploit them as they can when they come. We see this in the so-called global South, and of course in the global North, whatever, exploitation, everyone's happy to exploit them in any number of ways, so on and so forth. So I'm not saying there's clean hands anywhere, but this conundrum of kind of a failure of the will at the level of kind of the demos of demos gratos, the fact that people sometimes actually lack the power to advocate for themselves. The answer to this, since Plato, again, is actually education. And this is where education actually, I think, has like it's right. I think it's absolutely appropriate that parents should be going to school board meetings and losing their minds, because they understand the live wire. Now, are they being influenced by people like Chris Rufo and by money from the Heritage Fund? Yeah, of course. But the point, though, is that whether it's civil rights integration, Brown v. Board of Education, the school, questions of education, questions of how the demos, how their souls are formed, that I think is the ground zero. That doesn't so much solve your question, but that gives us an insight into how to work with the question. Paulo Freire in Brazil, he was mentored by Helder Camara, a very famous Catholic socialist and bishop, and he went into the favelas of Brazil, just the poorest of the poorest areas in the world, to teach people how to read and write. Alphabetization. And a lot of people are like, oh, he believed like book it, reading rainbow. The reason he was doing it was because there was a poll requisite of being able to pass a basic literacy standard in order to vote. And that was how the ruling classes maintained their majority over the top of these millions and millions of not only poor, but also historically, remember, Brazil is where slavery was ended, the last state to end slavery, also mostly Black favelas. He went into those places and spaces, taught people how to read in order to give them the ability to vote. And I think it's it was like the solution to the question you're asking almost coming to life through education, through alfabetización. But when you dig down further into Freire's ideas, it wasn't just a realpolitik lever. He did get exiled because of its political effects in the late 50s. In the mid 60s is when he got exiled, first to Bolivia, then to Chile, and then he started traveling Switzerland, the United States. But below all that, we had his theological foundations, where he saw this primordial relation between the word and the world, between the logos of John and the ruach of Genesis. And for me, as a Catholic, as a socialist, as someone who cares about education, as someone who really perceives, in the question you've asked, something really difficult and really prescient, and talk about realism, I mean, that is as real as it gets, I think. I think Freire's approach to see education and reading and literacy in this very broad, but also very realistic and concrete way, I think that's how we attack the question through education. And of course, the question from there, then we fight over that. Whose education, who gets to teach, who gets to decide, all that stuff. But we're going to fight over that anyway. But as long, if we can make that more explicit, that would make me happy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a helpful way to look at it, because I don't know, for me, I asked this question because I don't know, like my priorities at this point, and again, maybe I need to mature a little bit more, are not primarily political. It's mostly like I'm interested in the cultural, the aesthetic question, because for me, like I grew up very much in a super bourgeois liberal bubble, like the epitome of privilege, and I saw how existentially, aesthetically, it's like super vapid. So socialism, populism, politically, I don't know. I mean, that's not for me. That's not the biggest question. What attracts me to these positions is that there's a critique of the status quo. There's a critique of what I perceive to be the vapidness. And I think, again, politically, perhaps there's not too much of an overlap, but I think somebody needs to be asking these questions about the elitism, this kind of bourgeois aesthetic sense of, I don't know, this bourgeois sense of reality that's can become very stifling after a while. You know?
I think when you frame it that way, and I think if people would use bourgeois in that sense to be what they mean by status quo,
Mhm.
the the classes of society that do not have to have their souls stirred, neither by God nor by existential threats to their life. The people who sleep basically on Valium at night or whatever. That's a social expression that it would be really unfortunate, but I'm suspecting maybe it is, if that was the draw of post-liberalism. It's like, oh, we can work on that, but that not this way. Like
Yeah.
look, behind me, and those who are listening to this can't see what you can see, but behind me are my guitars. And so like, look, I am with you as an aesthete, right? What I care about the most, what for me is my kind of atomic element for my investment in both education and in politics is music. And it was for Plato too, by the way. Plato's Republic is primarily about musical and physical education. It's not really about anything else, really. He goes ad nauseum about how the guardians need to not learn too much minor music because they don't want it, but they need to learn some so they're not too scared of it. And so this idea that the temperaments and the soul is built through an aesthetic education. I mean, now we're speaking, I think, the same language, and I don't think you should be self-effacing about that. And I would add that one of the real failures of the kind of scientific Marxists and the, I would say, Philistine left are those who have really forgotten or conveniently ignored the fact that the poetics of the left has always been in union songs and protest songs and liberation songs and spiritual music. Martin Luther King, the last thing he said before he died is he asked to have the song "Precious Lord, Take My Hand" played that night, which of course a night he wouldn't see. As an old Thomas Dorsey spiritual from the 1920s or 30s, I believe. And this is where, for me, I'm an American exceptionalist on one thing, and that's when it comes to it's folk music, because I believe in the American kind of barbaric experiment, the souls of Black folk, the sorrow songs, that's Du Bois there, these melodies and ideas and stories that rose from people in Appalachia and the deltas and in slums and cities. And this particular expression of the kind of American roots, and when I say American, I mean from the Yukon all the way to Tierra del Fuego. There's a deposit there. There's an aesthetic deposit, and that is maximally visible. That is, of course, rooted in other things like the African one beat and like any number of imports and exports all around the world. But to me, that is where my socialism and where my leftism and really where my Catholicism find their most, I would say, most effective, and I would also say their most fundamental form of expression. And I think that is, the critique of atheism, of atheists don't have any hymns, was obviously the best one. Like, there's just zero question that is the best argument. It's the only argument. I would say to the post-liberal or to the fellow aesthete, maybe yourself included, but I'm thinking about your listeners, like, don't sleep on the left when it comes to aesthetics and these kinds of things, from the folk all the way into what I mainly disagree with, which is the German Frankfurt School work on aesthetics, which doesn't care very much for the American folk music. And that's where I kind of part ways with that version of the left. But no, this isn't just personal, though. I think that the point you're raising in terms of, and you can see the decrepit state of the aesthetics of right populism, frankly. You can see it. Its fruit is rotten to the core. We can talk about fonts. I'm talking MAGA right now, right? And it revels in this kind of perversity of ugliness, right? And like, sure, there's a whole way in which, especially Americans and modernists or whatever, can kind of take the irony of that and turn it and twist it around and find their way into some very chic position. But like, let's be like basic and honest, right? The aesthetics of the right are hideous. Not only fascism and the barbarism and stuff like that, but also that. And whenever you get into sort of like the chic aesthetics of the Nazi propaganda or Stalinism or, cultural revolution, stuff like that. It's all plastic. Like, it can be broken through. Try to do that to, to Woody Guthrie. Try to do that to Bob Dylan. Try to do that to Mahalia Jackson. That to me, that's my politics, plain and simple.
Yeah.
That's my socialism. If you rob me of my Mounier and of all my historical cues and stuff, that's where I end up, with all of it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more to be said about socialist aesthetics. I hope somebody writes something about it at some point.
Yeah, we'll see.
One day. So Sam, before we go, anything you want to plug?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, not really. Just Google and see what's out there. My website is samrocha.com. I've got some stuff, some albums, some books and stuff. Honestly, I did a season 1 of a podcast called Folk Phenomenology, which is the title of my 2015 book. And I think that in those discussions with my guests, we were able to not only get into the aesthetic question that we've been able to break open here, but also the pathos of that. If there was one thing to watch, it's I have a discourse with Vanessa Zuleta Goldberg.
Oh yeah, I know her.
Yeah, and we talk about liberation theology, and we start off talking about Romero, and but like by the end of it, we're talking about like divine love, and it's very emotional, and it's very like it's just shot through with with something that you can't find in like the New Sincerity, or like something that's like explicitly religious, explicitly Catholic, explicitly Latin American, sure, but not sociologically bound, I think, at all. That's an episode I would say check that out. The context is liberation theology. Obviously, that context is haunted by the left and by Catholic socialists. But I had a lot of people who went into it with their hackles up because of the liberation theology thing, and also because of any number of antipathies to socialism, and came out of it being like, well, I know you both really love Jesus. So I guess I've got to stay my hand here and think about this a bit more. And loving Jesus and writing songs and talking about it emotionally or whatever, I mean, come on. That's that is the ticket. That is the old, the new, and every evangelization. That's what it's about.
Yeah. Well, Sam, thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.